Smell of my grandmother's pecan pie filled the whole car before I even pulled into the driveway, and I remember thinking that was a good sign. I'm 32 years old. I drove 4 hours from Nashville to spend Thanksgiving with my mother's side of the family at the house I grew up in. I had the pie in the back seat, still warm, wrapped in a dish towel my grandmother gave me before she passed. It was the one thing I knew my mother actually loved. I thought maybe it would help. My aunt, my mother's younger sister, answered the door before I could knock. She looked at the pie, then at me, and said, "We're doing it small this year, just the people who matter." Then she stepped aside to let me in, which felt like a contradiction until I got to the kitchen and understood what she meant. My mother was standing at the counter. My brother was sitting at the table with his wife. Their 2 kids were running circles in the living room. My brother's wife, I'll call her what she's always been to me, which is nothing, looked up from her phone just long enough to register that I'd walked in, then looked back down. My mother said, without turning around, "I wasn't sure you were coming. I had RSVP'd 3 weeks ago. I had confirmed again the Tuesday before." I said I was coming. She turned then, looked at the pie, said, "We already have dessert." Then she nodded toward the counter where a store-bought cheesecake sat in its plastic clamshell, still sealed. I set my grandmother's pie on the counter anyway. Dinner was ready within the hour. My aunt called everyone to the table. There were 7 place settings. I counted twice. My brother, his wife, their 2 kids, my mother, my aunt, and one more, a family friend I'd never met, a woman named Philippa whom my mother had apparently known from church for 2 years and spoken of to me never once. There was no plate for me. My mother said, "Oh, I must have miscounted," in the tone of voice she uses when she wants you to know she didn't miscount. My aunt got up and found a folding chair from the hall closet. She brought it to the end of the table where there was no room and wedged it between the wall and my brother's daughter's high chair. My mother put a paper plate in front of me. Everyone else had her good china, the set that had been in the family since before I was born, the set she promised to leave me in the will she'd revised 3 times. My brother's wife said to no one in particular, "It's cozy." I looked at the paper plate. I looked at my grandmother's pecan pie on the counter, untouched, while the store-bought cheesecake had already been moved to the center of the table like it was a centerpiece. I thought about the 4-hour drive. I thought about the confirmation text my mother had read and not responded to. I thought about the dish towel. I stood up. My mother said, "Sit down, we're about to say grace." I said, "I'm going to head out." She said, "Don't be dramatic." I picked up my grandmother's pie. I said, "Safe travels, everyone." I walked to the front door, opened it, and closed it behind me without slamming it. That part took effort. The drive back felt longer than 4 hours. I stopped at a gas station outside of Murfreesboro and sat in the parking lot eating pecan pie with a plastic fork I found in my glove compartment. It was the best thing I'd eaten all day, which wasn't saying much, but it was mine. If you've ever driven home early from a family dinner because they forgot to set a place for you, subscribe and tell me what state you're in. I read every single comment. My phone had been buzzing since the county line. I let it go to voicemail. By the time I got back to my apartment and unlocked the door, I had 11 missed calls, 3 from my mother, 2 from my aunt, 6 from a number I didn't recognize. I set the pie on my kitchen counter and sat down on the floor with my back against the cabinet, because sometimes that's just the posture the moment calls for. Then I opened my banking app. My mother and I had shared a joint savings account for 6 years. It started when my father died and she said she needed help managing things, the utilities, the property tax on the house, the car insurance she kept forgetting to pay. I was 26 and I thought that was what good daughters did. I set up automatic transfers, 40% of every paycheck, into that account like clockwork. I scrolled through the transaction history. October, $1,800 to a flooring company. My mother had mentioned refinishing the hardwood, but she had not mentioned asking me. September, $650 at a boutique in Franklin. August, $940, a weekend at a resort in Gatlinburg. The reservation name in the memo field was my brother's. July, $280, a restaurant I'd never been to. A charge that came in on a Sunday evening when I had been at work in Nashville, and she had been, I now understood, at dinner with Philippa. I kept scrolling. $300 here, $500 there. A jewelry store charge I didn't recognize for $415. A recurring transfer starting 14 months ago, going out every second Friday to an account I didn't have a record of, for $200 exactly. I did the math on my phone's calculator. Then I did it again because the first answer didn't seem right. It was right. Over the past 2.5 years, approximately $31,000 had left that account for expenses I had not approved, had not been consulted on, and in many cases had not been told about. $31,000 that I had earned moved into a shared account because I believed I was helping my mother, and watched disappear into flooring and resort weekends and a jewelry store charge I still could not place. I didn't feel angry yet. I felt something colder than that. I opened my laptop. I had a friend, someone I'd worked with at my last job. Someone who understood money the way I understood it was possible to understand money without actually being in finance. Her name was Vera. I texted her, "Are you up?" She called back in 4 minutes. I told her what I'd found. I heard her pull up a chair on her end. She said, "Send me screenshots, all of them, go back as far as the account will let you." I forwarded everything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You can remove yourself from this account tonight. You don't need her signature. You opened it, your name is primary. You can separate the accounts and move your portion to your personal checking before anything else goes out." I said, "Is that legal?" She said, "You're not taking her money. You're taking yours." I asked how much was actually mine to claim. We went through it together, line by line. The initial deposit had been mine. Every automatic transfer had been mine. The only deposits from my mother's side were 3, totaling just under $900 over the entire 6 years. Vera said, "So essentially all of it." I said, "Yeah." I transferred the remaining balance, $4,200, to my personal account. I removed my mother from the joint account. I contacted the bank and flagged the recurring $200 transfers for review. Then I took a photo of the pie on my counter, just for myself, and went to bed. I slept better than I had in months, which I didn't expect and probably should have. My mother called at 7:12 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was already awake, drinking coffee, watching the sun come up over the parking lot from my kitchen window. I let it ring. She called again at 7:19. And again at 7:31. At 7:45, my brother called. I picked up because my brother and I have a different relationship. Or at least I thought we did. He said, "Mom's upset." I said, "I know." He said, "She says you took money out of her account." I said, "I removed myself from the account we shared. The money I moved was mine." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "She says she's been paying into that account for years." I told him the 3 deposits, the amounts, the dates. I had them memorized by then. He said, "You can't just do this on Thanksgiving." I said, "I didn't plan it for Thanksgiving specifically." He said, "She's really hurt." I thought about the paper plate. I thought about the store-bought cheesecake. I said, "She set 7 places at the table, and I wasn't one of them." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That was an accident." I said, "Okay." He said, "Are you really going to blow up the family over a plate?" I said, "I'm not blowing anything up. I'm separating a bank account." He hung up. 20 minutes later, my aunt texted. Not about the account, she didn't know about that yet, but about Thanksgiving. She said she was sorry about the seating. She said it had been a miscommunication. She said my mother hadn't meant for it to come across the way it did. She used the word sensitive in a way that made it clear she was describing me, not the situation. I put my phone face down and finished my coffee. By noon, my brother's wife had sent me a Facebook message. We were not Facebook friends. She had found me anyway. The message said that what I was doing was financial abuse, and that I should be ashamed of myself. I read it once, didn't respond, and reported the message as harassment, not because I thought it would do much, but because the option existed and I wanted to use it. At 2 p.m., my mother called from a number I didn't have saved. I answered by accident, honestly. I thought it was my dentist's office. She said, "I know you're angry." I said, "I'm not angry." She said, "Then why are you doing this?" I said, "I'm protecting my money." She said, "That money was for the family." I said, "I know that's what you believe." She said, "I need you to put it back." I said, "I'm not going to do that." She said, "I could take you to court." I said, "Okay." And I meant it. Not as a dare, just as an acknowledgement that that was her right and also an outcome I had already considered and was not afraid of. She said, "You've changed." I said, "I think I've just gotten clearer." She hung up. I made a sandwich and went back to work. I had a project due by end of day Friday and I was not going to let Thanksgiving week derail it. That evening, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from a number with a 615 area code I didn't recognize. I almost deleted it. Something made me play it. It was my uncle, my father's older brother. He lives about 40 minutes outside of Nashville, out toward the country, and he and I have always had a quieter kind of relationship. Occasional phone calls, Christmas cards, one dinner a year if we planned ahead. He said, "Hey, kiddo. I heard some things through the grapevine, and I just wanted to say I'm sorry you had a rough holiday. If you want to talk, I'm here. No pressure. I'm up late." I called him back that night. He listened for a long time. When I got to the part about the paper plate, he made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He said, "That's something." He said it the way someone says something when they mean something else entirely, but they're being polite about it. He said, "Your dad would have said something at that table." I said, "I know." He said, "I think you handled it right. You didn't make a scene. You just left and then you handled your business." I said, "I'm worried I'm going to regret it." He said, "The account or leaving dinner?" I said, "Either. Both." He said, "The account, you won't regret. You've been carrying that for years. The dinner, that wasn't your fault, but you know that already." I did know that. I just needed to hear it in a voice I trusted. He said, "You know, when your dad and your uncle, your mom's brother, used to argue about money, your dad always said the same thing. A debt that never gets named never gets paid." He meant it about more than money. A pause. "I think you're finally naming some things." I thanked him. He told me to come out for dinner sometime soon. He said his wife had been asking about me. I said I would, and I meant it. I slept well again. The bank reviewed the flagged transfers within 48 hours. The recurring $200, the one I hadn't recognized, going out every second Friday for 14 months, turned out to be linked to an account my mother had opened in my brother's name, funded entirely by the joint account I had been contributing to. I had been, without knowing it, bankrolling my brother's spending money for over a year. The bank confirmed this in writing. The review opened a fraud inquiry. They froze the receiving account pending documentation. I received a certified letter from my mother's attorney on a Tuesday. I read it in the parking lot of my office building standing next to my car because that was where I happened to be when the notification came. The letter said she was pursuing a claim for unjust removal of joint funds and requested I return the $4,200 within 10 business days. I photographed the letter and sent it to Vera. She sent it to a friend of hers who did family law consultations. The friend called me that afternoon. She said my mother's case was extremely weak given that I was the primary account holder and the deposit history clearly showed the imbalance of contributions. She said the fraud inquiry the bank had opened actually helped me. She said, if she files, it'll cost her more in legal fees than she'd recover, and she probably knows that. I said, so what do I do? She said, nothing, right now. If she actually files, you respond. But I'd guess she won't. She was right. My mother did not file. What she did instead was call my uncle, my dad's brother, and tell him her version. He listened politely and then called me afterward and said, she didn't mention the paper plate. He said it so dryly that I laughed for the first time since Wednesday. He also said, she told me you took everything. I said, I took $4,200. He said, I know. He already knew. He'd done the math when I'd told him. I didn't hear from my mother directly for 3 weeks. My aunt sent occasional texts. Gentle ones, not accusatory. Just small things. A recipe. A photo of her dog. A news article she thought I'd find interesting. I appreciated that. I responded to all of them. I didn't ask about my mother, and my aunt didn't volunteer. My brother and I did not speak. A month after Thanksgiving, a small package arrived at my apartment. No return address. Nashville postmark. Inside was a folded piece of paper and, wrapped in tissue, a silver bangle bracelet I recognized immediately. It had been my grandmother's. My mother had been wearing it at Thanksgiving dinner, the note said in my uncle's handwriting. Not my father's brother, but my mother's father, my grandfather, whom I hadn't spoken to since the summer, because he lived in a memory care facility, and some days were better than others. For the one who showed up, Grandpa Wes. Except my grandfather hadn't written it. His handwriting had gotten too shaky for that 2 years ago. The note was in my aunt's handwriting, close enough to his that I almost missed it, but I know her lowercase e's and I know his. I called my aunt. She picked up on the second ring. I said, did you write this note? A pause. Then, he asked me to send it. He remembered the bracelet. He wanted you to have it. I just wrote down what he said. I sat down at my kitchen table. The bracelet was in my palm, cool and lightweight. My grandmother had worn it every day for 40 years. My aunt said quietly, he had a good day last Tuesday. He asked about you specifically. He said, did Mara stand up for herself at Thanksgiving? I said, how did he know about Thanksgiving? She said, your mother told him. She told him you'd been difficult. A beat. He said, good. I hadn't cried yet. Not in the parking lot, not in the gas station. Not at 2 a.m. when the voicemail came in and I'd sat on the floor of my kitchen. But I cried then, at my kitchen table, with my aunt still on the line and my grandmother's bracelet in my hand. She didn't say anything, which was exactly right. When I could talk again, I said, tell him thank you. She said she would. I put the bracelet on and wore it for the rest of the day. I wore it the next day too. I've worn it every day since. The bank resolved the fraud inquiry 6 weeks later. The unauthorized transfers to my brother's account were confirmed. He was required to repay the institution. My mother, as the account holder who had authorized the transfers, was held jointly responsible. Their credit took a hit. It wasn't something I'd asked for or orchestrated. It was simply the outcome of a process I'd started by flagging what I'd found. I didn't feel triumphant about it. I want to be clear about that. There's a version of this story where you feel like you've won something, and I don't think that version is quite honest. What I felt was something more like relief that I'd stopped, that I'd noticed, that I hadn't let another year go by, with 40% of every paycheck moving into an account I wasn't watching closely enough. My grandfather had a bad stretch in January and didn't recognize my aunt for 2 weeks. He came back out of it, the way he sometimes does, in February. She visited him on a Wednesday and called me after. She said he'd asked if I was okay. She said she told him yes. She said he'd nodded and said, she's her father's daughter. I don't know if I'm telling this story for sympathy. I don't think I am. I think I'm telling it because there's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the one who keeps the lights on for people who have stopped noticing the lights. And I didn't have a name for it for a long time. I have one now. This past spring, I found an apartment with a second bedroom and a kitchen that gets morning light. I moved in on a Saturday. My uncle and his wife helped me carry boxes. His wife made sandwiches and we ate them on the floor of the living room because there was no furniture yet. Just boxes and afternoon light and the sound of the neighborhood outside. He looked around at the empty space, the walls bare, the whole room still full of possibility. He said, "Your dad would have liked this apartment." I said, "Yeah, he would have." He said, "You want me to fix that cabinet, the one in the bathroom that doesn't close all the way?" I said, "Yes." He fixed it. My mother has not been to the apartment. We speak occasionally. Short calls, careful ones. The kind of calls where you measure every word before you say it and hang up feeling like you ran a mile even though you only talked for 8 minutes. I don't know what we are to each other right now. I know what we were. I know what I needed us to be and what we turned out to be instead. The gap between those two things still has weight, but the weight is different now. More like something I'm carrying on purpose than something that was set on top of me without warning. My grandmother's bracelet is on my wrist as I write this. The pecan pie recipe is saved in my phone in a folder I labeled Simply Hers. I make it on holidays now, for whoever I'm spending them with. Last Thanksgiving, I made it for my uncle and his wife and a neighbor who had nowhere to go, and we ate it warm at a table where every seat was set on purpose. Every seat had a plate,